Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Big Story podcast, Carbon Copy's latest avenue for engaging audiences with snapshots of what's happening in the world of climate and energy. From complex global topics like climate finance to on ground issues like just transition and extreme weather, this podcast aims to make climate issues a part of dinner table conversation. I'm Anushka, the editor of Carbon Copy, and joining me for this episode is Archana Chaudhary, who is on Carbon Copy's editorial board and author of our latest big story, Climate Talks in 2025, Converging Crises, Rising Stakes, and Diminished Returns. Welcome, Archana. Let me begin by asking you what's the overall mood of global climate talks this year?
Thanks, Anushka. 2025 was supposed to be a year of delivery. UN negotiations in Bonn, Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development or FFD4 in Sevilla, COP30 summit in Belém. But increasingly, what we're seeing is mounting frustration, and there's a growing sense that political and economic realities may end up sidelining climate ambition. There's a real risk that this becomes a year of deferral rather than decisive action.
Okay, so what are the major roadblocks that you see?
Uh, it is a tough mix. There is obviously the political gridlock that we're seeing right up from the US. We've been seeing escalating conflicts in the Middle East, and frankly, there's the most important problem, which is the shrinking pool of finance for climate. At Bonn, India and the G77 plus China grouping had made it clear, and they tried to push that climate finance should be prioritized on their agenda. This was grounded in legal commitments that were made in Paris from the Paris Agreement onwards and in the years through. But we've only seen unmet promises from the developed countries. Even at Bonn, we've seen the developed countries pushing back. They cited the strain of multiple wars, economic uncertainty, and that is where the situation is complicated because what's more alarming is how conflicts from Ukraine to Gaza or in the Middle East, these are not just disrupting diplomacy globally, but they're also actively draining resources. In 2024 alone, we've seen global military spending hit a staggering $2.7 trillion. That's more than 50 times what NATO countries spent on climate finance for the world's poorest nations. And it's not just about budgets. Ultimately, militaries are massive emitters, and armies contribute around 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we are literally fighting against ourselves while the climate crisis escalates. And that's where we stand, Anushka.
So where does then this leave, global conferences like the Bonn and the FFD for? Like, what is their role then? Are they not living up to expectations?
There's no real straightforward answer to this at the moment because it's evident that the folk at these conferences are trying to meet expectations. What is happening is that their credibility is being tested. For instance, let's talk about FFD4 in Sevilla. On paper, it launched the Sevilla Platform for Action to fix how development and climate finance are delivered. But the real test now lies in the implementation. And that's already been dealt a blow. The US pulled out of the process altogether, as we know. They've been objecting to the UN's proposed role in debt negotiations and the calls that for tripling of MDB reforms and lending. That's one massive gap in leadership from the world's largest economy. Even the EU, which has long positioned itself as a climate frontrunner, is backpedaling. At the EU summit in June, French President Emmanuel Macron publicly called for a pause in new environmental regulation and even a delay in the bloc's 2040 climate targets. All this has been said in the name of economic strain, competitiveness. That kind of retreat from leadership is sending a chilling signal about the global north's willingness to lead, especially in a year when delivery is absolutely critical. And it's precisely this vacuum that is pushing the global south countries to step up in this leadership vacuum. The BRICS bloc is now expanded. It represents more than 40% of the global economy, and it's trying to work on a more coordinated, unified stance. especially around finance. For many of these countries, climate ambition without finance is just not workable. It's also very unjust. And their alignment ahead of COP30 could be a turning point. BRICS bloc now expanding beyond Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to 11 full members. So now we have UAE, we have Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran. These countries represent almost half the world's economy. So the global south can hopefully have a bigger and stronger voice in future climate negotiations, or that is at least the hope.
Right. So there's the Baku to Belém roadmap, which was announced at COP29. This is to mobilize $1.3 trillion in climate finance by 2030. So is there a possibility that this would be successful?
That is the hope. But right now, as things stand, it's more a vision than it is a reality. Because for it to be credible, three things are essential. One is binding mechanisms to ensure delivery of this promise. Second is a fair burden sharing framework for the developed countries. And third is clarity on what kind of finance is on offer, grants versus loans. What will be made available? The $250 million disbursement from the Loss and Damage Fund that was recently announced is a start. But frankly, it's a drop in the ocean, given the scale of the need for climate finance. And without structural reforms to the international financial architecture, it's hard to see how this roadmap will gain traction.
Okay, let's talk a bit about adaptation because this is something that often gets sidelined in global discussions. So, can you tell us a bit about adaptation finance?
Yes, we recently did do even a paper on adaptation finance, and what has been very clear on adaptation, even in the global fora, is that it is severely underfunded and yet it is the most urgent need for most of the vulnerable countries. Small island states, parts of sub Saharan Africa, South Asia, are facing climate extremes that demand immediate resilience building. But the bulk of global finance is still flowing towards mitigation. So, without adaptation support, countries are being asked to fight a fire with no tools, no water.
Right. And where does India fit into all of this beyond its role in G77 and BRICS?
It's a complex position for India. On one hand, it's advocating strongly for climate finance, equity, capacity building, and is a leader for the global south. On the other hand, there's this growing international expectation that it will scale up ambition. So that tension is visible in its push for technology transfer, more concessional finance, before it makes deeper mitigation commitments. India is walking a tightrope, but it is also helping shape a more equitable global conversation, and I think that is worth watching.
So all of this is also unfolding in a year where countries are supposed to be submitting their nationally determined contribution to NDC. Can you tell us a bit about what's happening on that front? Have countries submitted it? What's happening?
So NDCs are the key pressure point, and the Paris Agreement basically requires countries to submit new or enhanced nationally determined contributions in 2025. This is to be informed by the global stocktake that process concluded in 2023. But so far, very few countries have actually submitted anything. And many developing nations are making it very clear that without clarity on finance, they cannot possibly show more ambition. So there is a risk of a standoff this year. That is very real.
Okay, so that leads me to my last question. Do you think that COP30, which will be held this November in Brazil, can it offer some respite to the global south?
It has the potential, certainly. Anushka, Brazil has laid out a strong agenda: renewables, deforestation, just transitions. But its officials seem to also be realistic. Because without progress on finance, and this is a message that is coming to us again and again through the letters that the presidency has been releasing, is that without this progress in finance, many countries won't be able to raise their ambition. And for the global south, climate action without finance isn't just a bad deal, as we saw last year, it's just unviable. So, this recognition that for much of the global south, climate action without finance is not politically or economically tenable is very clear. India, Brazil, AOSIS, the African group, they are all aligned in holding the line on finance equity. And most importantly, the UNFCCC's founding principle, which is common but differentiated responsibilities. So ultimately, the key will lie in Brazil's ability in building a consensus at COP30, which is inclusive, a consensus that does not crumble under geopolitical pressures and economic imbalances. And that's a lot to ask.
So all eyes on Brazil then. Thanks so much, Archana, for unpacking all of this. And thank you to our listeners. Do tune in to our next episode of the Big Story podcast.
Thanks, Anushka.